But because we've thought of the atonement as punishment for sin instead of restoration for sin, what's happened, and this has messed a lot of people up, and I don't care. It's just the truth. What's happened is we thought the atonement happened at the cross. That's what we thought. The atonement happened at the cross. Listen, this isn't to lessen the cross. As you guys know, the cross is my jam. You'd be hard-pressed to find anybody that teaches about the cross more than me. I mean, I actually teach that the cross is the power unto life. That Jesus saw the cross as the foundation from where he would inherit eternal life. Right? But the atonement was not at the cross. If Jesus would have just died on the cross and then that was it, there would have never been an atonement. And so the atonement couldn't have happened at the cross. What I will say, though, is the work that was needed for there to be an atonement is wrapped up in the cross. But the cross is not the atonement. And what I want to say is there's a whole process that goes down before there can be an atonement, and the cross is part of the process. It has to go down before there can even be an atonement. And you might think, what am I talking about? Well, I'm going to run you through all these examples and details in the Old Testament. And you guys will just have to bear with me. And let me talk about these things because they excite me and you love me. And so because you love me, you let me talk about things that excite me. You guys ever notice how that works in relationships? I'm joking, man. But I'm right. Yes, yes. Well, thank you for loving me, Linda. Whether you know it or not, it is exciting. But we were just talking about how the atonement didn't happen at the cross. And that messes a lot of people up because they've been taught for so long atonement was about your sin needing to be punished. And then they paint the picture of a guy getting punished at the cross. And so therefore the cross had to be the atonement. But in the Old Testament shadows of the atonement for sin, the atonement for sin didn't happen when the high priest sacrificed the bulls and goats on the altar. That's not when the atonement happened. If you read in the Old Testament scriptures that talk about the Day of Atonement. And if the high priest stopped there, and after he offered the bulls and goats on the altar, if he would have just stopped there could have never been any atonement. And if you look in the Day of Atonement, the atonement wasn't until the high priest appeared in the holiest place, in the presence of God, by the power of the blood of the bulls and goats. Or with the blood of the bulls and the goats. The atonement didn't happen until the high priest could get into the holiest place in the presence of God with the blood of the bulls and the goats. That's when the atonement started getting down. So if the high priest on the Day of Atonement just went and offered the blood and bulls and goats on the altar and was like, hey, that's good enough, man. This blood's kind of gross, I'm done. I'm just, I'm sharing with you guys some of the deep thoughts in my heart. When I was a young guy reading the scriptures, wow, man. You start reading Leviticus sometimes and all the blood. And you're like, my goodness, Lord. And I thank God that he gives me understanding now. Right? But if he would have just stopped there and not gone through the bronze laver and not gone through the holy place and into the holiest place, there could have never been any atonement at all. And so the way this would go down is on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would offer bulls and goats. They would sacrifice bulls and goats on something called the bronze altar. Right? Now, to connect some of these things, the bronze altar was a figure or a shadow of the cross. Okay? That's what it was pointing to. The cross is the altar that bronze altar in the Old Testament was talking about. So they would sacrifice the bulls and goats, and then what they would do is they would get into this giant bronze laver that is part of the temple or the tabernacle, the earthly tabernacle. And they would pass through that bronze laver. It's filled with water. It's like a giant bathtub. You know what I'm saying? And we've seen some nice giant bronze bathtubs nowadays, the modern bathtubs. You could see some of those kinds of things. And so they would pass through that bronze laver, and they would have the blood of the bulls and goats with them, and they would pass through the outer court, and they would pass into the inner court with the blood of the bulls and the goats, and then they would pass into the holiest place, the Holy of Holies, in the presence of God, and they would have the blood of the bulls and goats with them, and they would sprinkle it. Right? They would sprinkle it on the mercy seat. That's what they would do once they got into the holiest place. Now, I like to give people explanations or understanding about why the blood. Because you could think of why the blood? Especially if you're wondering, if it's not about punishment, then what's the blood about? Right? Now, when you look at the blood was the power by which the high priest could enter the holiest place. And something I want you guys to keep in the back of your mind is there was something that was keeping us from the holy place. There's something that stood opposed to mankind being in the holiest place. And the blood became the power by which the high priest could enter into the holiest place and stand in the presence of God. And I'm going to get to this in great detail, but if you hadn't already figured it out, it wasn't God that stood in the way of mankind being in the presence of God. Right? It wasn't God. And so the blood was the power by which the high priest could enter into the holiest place. The sprinkling of the blood wasn't for God's conscience. If you read in the letter to the Hebrews, it doesn't say that God's conscience is purged by the blood. Whose conscience is purged by the blood? Ours. Okay, so there's something that goes down in our conscience, in the conscience of a human being, when they would enter into the presence of God and stand face to face with God. And the thing that would go down in our conscience wasn't a good thing. It wasn't born from life. And in fact, what it would do is it would work fear in our hearts and work condemnation in our hearts. Our own conscience would accuse us, and it would produce death in our hearts. Well, the blood was designed to purge our conscience from the accusation that was accusing us. It was designed to purge our conscience from the condemnation that would come alive inside of us when we stood in the presence of God. So there was no way for the high priest to be in the presence of God without the blood. The blood was the power for him to be able to stand there without a conscience that accused him. It was the power to justify the high priest from the accusation of the evil one, is what it is. Right? You guys following that? And so it wasn't for the conscience of God, the blood. It was for the conscience of the high priest. It was so his eyes could be anointed with eye salve. I talked about in Revelation 3 last week, and I'm going to get into it more. The blood was in order to anoint the high priest's eyes with eye salve, so the shame of his nakedness wouldn't be uncovered in his sight. And the point was, in his eyes being anointed with eye salve, and his nakedness not being uncovered in his sight, it would justify him from the accusation of the evil one. So the blood of the sacrifice was with the intent to justify the high priest, not to God, but to justify the high priest from the accusation of the evil one that was coming against him. Because Satan was accusing the brethren to God all our days, it says. It says you overcome the accusation of the evil one by the blood of the Lamb and the word of your testimony. I talked about this in the Talmud, but when Moses went up the mountain and stood on holy ground to get the tablets of testimony, and when he was standing on that holy ground, it was grace ground. It was actually sapphire stone, which is stone for grace. And if you look at the stone that the tablets of testimony were written on, they weren't written on like martyr stone. They weren't written on the stone, the bricks that we make. The tablets of testimony were written on sapphire stone. Moses was standing on sapphire stone, the same stone that they said is the throne of grace, a sapphire throne of grace. And so when Moses was going up the mountain to receive the tablets of testimony, it was said in the Talmud, and they didn't understand what this stuff was about, but it was said that there were angels along the way telling him he couldn't go up there, standing opposed to him standing in the presence of God, telling him he had no right to be there, that it wasn't right for him to be there. And you can read several other examples of this that I'll get to, but in Zechariah it talks about Satan standing opposed to Joshua the high priest when he's in the presence of God. Right? And so Joshua the high priest needed to be justified not to God, not from God, but from the accusation of the evil one, the one that stood opposed to him. He needed to be justified. He needed to have his eyes anointed with eye salve. So when he was in the presence of God, he didn't see his nakedness, and the serpent couldn't uncover his nakedness. But instead, he would see the white raiment that he was clothed in, and he would see the crown of life that God had put on his head, and that would rebuke the devil. That's why God says, "The Lord rebuke you, Satan." It's just not a brand that's been plucked out of the fire. And so the blood was the power for the high priest to stand in the presence of God and not have his conscience condemn him. And what the blood did is it served as a testimony to rebuke the accusation of the evil one. That was the purpose. Now what would go down is the people, in seeing that the high priest was justified from the accusation of the evil one, what would happen is the people would see the high priest was justified from the accusation, and that would purge their conscience from the accusation of the evil one also. And so the high priest would come out having not died in the presence of the Lord. And that would mean he was justified from the accusation. And if he's justified in the midst of the accusation, that's now purged my conscience from the accusation also. It's rebuked the devourer in my heart. It's now purged my conscience from the accusation. It's now an eye salve for my eyes, where I'm not beholding my body of death. My nakedness isn't being uncovered in my midst, but my nakedness has been covered upon by the life of God's Lamb. That's what the blood is in, the life is in the blood. You guys following that? And so the Day of Atonement in the Old Testament, it was a figure of something. It was trying to paint a picture for us of what would go down in Jesus. And the figure that it was a figure of the accuser of the brethren being cast out of the holiest place. Be gone. Be gone, devil. Be gone, Satan. Your accusation has been judged against. Right? And if you keep reading on the Day of Atonement, they had the scapegoat. Well, if you look at the word in scapegoat in Hebrew, it's Azazel. And you know what they said Azazel was? Satan. And so one of the goats would be sent from the camp, away from the camp, permanently banished from the camp. That was a picture of God casting out the evil one and casting out the accuser of the brethren. Hebrews talks about the accuser of the brethren being cast out after Jesus ascends to the right hand of God, doesn't it? The one who accused our brethren day and night has been cast out. Azazel, the Satan, the scapegoat, the one who accused us, the one who pointed at our body of death, all the time filling our conscience with the death we saw in ourselves, all the time uncovering our nakedness in our midst. He's been cast out of the presence of God because there's a human being that's now been clothed upon with the very life of God who had a body of death, and that body of death has been covered in life, and now we see that body, and that body's full of life, and it purges our conscience from the accusation of the evil one. We don't see ourselves as naked. We see ourselves as covered upon. Our eyes aren't filled with the body of death. Our eyes are filled with the flesh that can never die. And that casts out the accusation of the evil one from our hearts. And so when the scapegoat got sent away from the camp, Azazel, the casting out of the accusation of the evil one, that's when the Day of Atonement would be fulfilled. And the Day of Atonement was all about the restoration of God's people from the work of the devil. What was the work of the devil? Keep the people from the presence of God. How are we going to keep the people from the presence of God? We're going to uncover their nakedness every time they seek to approach God. We're going to point at the body of death they're clothed in every time they seek to approach God. That's going to work accusation in their hearts, and their hearts will condemn them when they're in the presence of God. That's the work of the devil. That leaves you laboring to try to give yourself life. That leaves you trying to clothe yourself with fig leaves. That leaves you all the time desiring peace and love and joy, laboring real hard to get it, working real hard to situate your life in just such a way that it can look so good that you feel it's a good life. Right? But the more you do that, the more you find the fruit of death everywhere. That's the work of the devil. Well, the Day of Atonement was about God destroying that. Does that make sense? You guys following that so far? You see what God's trying to atone for? It's not right for my people to stand in my presence with a heart that accuses them. It's not right for my people to stand in my presence and have condemnation manifest in them. It's not right for their minds to be filled with their nakedness or the body that's dying when they stand in my presence. It isn't right. We're going to atone for that. And we're going to do a thing where our people can stand in our presence, look us in the face, and their hearts be filled with love, and their hearts cry out, Abba, when they see us, instead of their hearts being filled with fear and shame. We're going to atone for that fear and shame they filled with, and the way we're going to atone for it is by manifesting our love in their hearts. Hallelujah. You see? He wants to atone for the fear that's in your heart. How do you think you atone for fear by punishing someone? So someone's filled with fear. You think you're going to atone for that fear by punishing them? No, you know how you're going to atone for that fear? You're going to mend their heart from fear. And the way you mend their heart from fear is by filling it with love.